You are listening to the Enormocast.
Oh my God, Janice. You know what I like about winter in the mountains? It's puffy weather.
Puffy weather?
That's what I said, puffy weather. You know, the time to cuddle down in your puffy, no matter where or when. But what if your puffy is some sort of overworked, filthy, greasy rag? Like you've been hanging out in front of the fryer at Long John Silver's. That doesn't sound like the kind of puffy for puffy weather.
More like dirtbag puffy weather.
Well, if you need a new puffy, Black Diamond has you covered like glitter on the prom queen.
Literally, covered in puffy.
First, there's the Vision Down Parka. The puffiest puffy for puffy weather ever. Warmer than your dear mother's hug. By the way, call your mother, she misses you.
She gave you life. Call your mother.
Do you want to layer your puffy? Maybe over a sweater? Then look no further than the Approach Down hoodie. Stash it away until it's puffy weather for real.
What about the Access Down hoodie? It's perfect for puffy weather that's on the cusp of sweater weather but could be puffy weather in an instant. I never leave home without my puffy, honey.
Check out blackdiamondequipment.com or your favorite local shop for the warmest, snuggliest puffies around. Oh my God! Who else loves puffy weather?
Listen, where are you playing in town? Are you playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah, the big
fantastic.
place,
Sold
that
it
side
out.
of town. That's a
Very
big
nice.
place. You sold
What's
it
that,
out.
20,000
I'll see.
You really should.
The hell are you doing?
I couldn't sleep. I'm checking the ropes. There was a frayed end on your rope, and I'm cutting it out.
Bad weather. No, later, anytime.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, La Sportiva, and with support from Maxim Ropes. Maxim has been keeping the Enormocast off the deck since 2012.
And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout for a discount on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello, and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is January 30th, 2024, around high noon here in Colorado, and this is episode 279 of the Enormocast. And in my opinion, this episode is historic. Can I have that kind of opinion about my own work? Well, I'm sticking to it. First of all, we have an interview today with David Smart. David Smart is an author. He's also a publisher, founder of Gripped Magazine up there in Canada. He's author of several books, 3 biographies, some guidebooks, and we are talking about his new book, Royal Robbins, The American Climber, a super in-depth biography of, one of the most influential climbers of all time, certainly in the United States, but also worldwide. Royal Robbins was one of the guys who kind of invented big wall climbing. And I literally mean that. They didn't know what they were doing, and they made it up as they went, much the same way the sport climbers in the 80s made it up as they went. And we arrived with a lot of the things that they decided. Well, same thing with Royal Robbins and his crew in Yosemite, figuring out big wall climbing, figuring out ethics of bolting, figuring out clean climbing using nuts, and then handing it off to the next generations. Great interview with David, great book, but perhaps more exciting than that, sorry, David, I think maybe you'd agree with that. We have an interview that I did in 2012 with the man himself, Royal Robbins. Yeah, pick up your jaw. I got an interview with Royal Robbins. Now, Royal Robbins passed away in 2017. I had interviewed him at the International Climbers Festival in 2012, and I shelved that interview. I had some problems with it, reservations, if you will. But reading Royal Robbins, The American Climber, and then talking to David has cleared me of those reservations. And I went back and listened to this interview, and a lot of the problems I had with it, I don't know, they kind of evaporated. Okay? I know I'm being a little mysterious, but we'll talk about it in the interview. However, the important thing to know is I have an interview with Royal Robbins in this podcast. Probably very close to the last thing he ever recorded, I would imagine. Again, for reasons that will be revealed. So yeah, the man himself, Royal Robbins, on tape, being interviewed by me, a little bit ineptly, but still his voice, his laughter, everything I believe about podcasting right there. All right. Anybody who is slightly disappointed that this isn't a TAPS episode yet, well, you know what? Royal Robbins, okay? The TAPS episode was recorded last night, so it'll be out next. I should have done this intro when I woke up this morning because I had that deep, husky voice. Down there where the Black Diamond guy lives. Whiskey'll do that to you. Anyhow, it's coming out next. It's a banger. I assure you. You guys really came through with the voicemails. Okay, first up is David Smart. You may know David Smart from such hits as Paul Preuss, Lord of the Abyss, perhaps Emilio Camici, The Angel of the Dolomites, maybe his memoir, A Youth Wasted Climbing. But now he has a new one out, Royal Robbins, The American Climber. And besides being a climbing author, David is a lifer. So let's get to it. Conversation with David Smart. Hey folks, you know that favorite local shop that I go on about at the end of my ads? Well, I say that because brick and mortar climbing shops have long been the L5 vertebra and the backbone of climbing culture. And now, Sportiva North America has decided to open an old-fashioned but newfangled retail store in Boulder, Colorado. You've heard of Boulder, right? Quaint little town on the Front Range of the Rockies. By the way, how do you know when a climber is from Boulder? Oh, they'll tell you. Shout out to Rose for that one. Anyway, the new Sportiva store will feature their most popular gear, opportunities to get your grubby hands on discounted equipment, and maybe most importantly, a chance to try on those shoes before you commit. Also, look for coming events as Sportiva gathers the community around climbing's best presenters, writers, and filmmakers. So if you swing through Boulder, and as a climber you know that you eventually should, check out the new Sportiva retail store on 2100 Broadway and see how it holds up against your own favorite local shop. So I came across the book that you wrote. I was looking through your catalog. You're a prolific author. I don't know what is the actual count. I tried to figure it out, but I couldn't find a page where it was all listed. What's your book count these days?
Well, I've written 2 novels, 3 biographies, and a memoir. And since I was young, I published local climbing guidebooks for Canadian climbing areas, but I've been long out of that. As guidebooks became more technical and much better, I moved on to other things. So yeah, I've written in a number of genres. So I love to write. So
yeah, I mean that's obvious. That's a lot of output. I have seen your name on a couple guidebooks as well, and I mean some stuff probably in conjunction with Gript. But the thing I came across, which I wish I'd seen at least a couple weeks ago when we started talking about doing this, was your memoir, A Youth Wasted Climbing.
Yes, yeah.
Is the name of it. And the description of it sounds fantastic. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that before we get into, we're here to really talk about your Royal Robbins book, but before we get into that, to talk about that very thing, your youth as a climber. I see you now as this very astute author, this scholar, because I have read several of your books, 3 of them anyway.
Thank you.
And, all of them histories, all of them incredibly well researched. And so you come across to me, and we've never met before, as this, like I said, this kind of scholar, this guy who writes these incredibly deep histories. But then I read sort of the back page, description of this youth wasted climbing, and you came up climbing just kind of like we all did, or many of us did, whatever it was, 40 now years ago. I know you're probably shocked to hear that number spoken out loud. Yeah, a little more than that, 45 or so. I'm at 34, I think. So, yeah. So tell me a little bit about, the context of that book and quote unquote, your youth wasted climbing. Is there a statement you could make about that where we could get into a few of the details?
Sure. Like a lot of people who started climbing in the 70s, it was traditional climbing only. At the time, it was all that existed. everyone's aspiration was to maybe get to wherever was kind of close by that was, had famous rock climbs. In my case, that was the Shwangunks in New York City. And then to try to go to Yosemite and just see if you could somehow climb big walls. And so a lot of people had these experiences of coming up in these little groups of people climbing, where you had this little team of what were mostly kind of misfits or kids. And like I've heard this story from so many people who started climbing at that time, hanging around at a crag somewhere. And there were these dynamics as you trying to work out your adolescence through climbing and, stuff with girls and drinking, smoking dope, what kind of shitty jobs you were going to do to be able to get out climbing as much as possible. And also like the sort of aspiration to climb harder. And like in so many of these groups, there were sort of that I talked about to people about, my friends who'd kind of grown up in around little crags everywhere across North America. There were so many similar dynamics. There was everyone as hard as they could, trying as hard as they could was climbing 10 plus, but there would always or often be the one guy who could climb 11 plus, right. And everyone trying to be like him and stuff like that. And so there was that. And like just having spent a whole life, basically, like I can barely remember anything from when I didn't climb. I was never a top climber. I wasn't even the best climber in my little group. I was, one of the 10 plus guys. I was never the 11 plus guy. And then we all like sport climbing came in and that turned into 12 plus and so on. And that big cultural change in climbing, especially in Canada, because we climb on limestone mostly in Canada, there are granite climbing areas, but it was very liberating to be able to use, large numbers of bolts, because trying to climb like, John Backer and Joshua Tree in 1978 on loose overhanging limestone. People did it. We all tried to do it, but it was very dangerous. So that book,
if I interrupt,
sure.
I literally had that thought reading about and looking at pictures of you as a youth. There's a few out there, not a lot actually. It's kind of hard to find out about your own personal climbing career because honestly, it's been overshadowed by you being a publisher of Gripped and contributing all this history. Your own history, I think's just kind of gone. Plus, it happened in the days of no documentation really. But that thought occurred to me, is that Canadian climbing kind of at that time sort of went zero to extreme really quickly because you didn't have a lot of choices. And I'm someone who's gone up and bolted limestone in the Canadian Rockies personally.
Right. Yeah.
And even this was the early aughts. I was kind of still running into this like not anti-bolt, but people really not that many people had picked up the charge to really start bolting that limestone.
Yeah.
And your alternative, unless you went to Squamish or the Bugs, was to go climb shattered limestone on gear, which is something that is like not that awesome and not that safe and limiting. So I had that same thought. So it's interesting to hear you say that, and that it was a liberation to look at all those walls and go, okay, we can climb these now with some level of safety.
Yeah, and like Canadian climbing had a different background than American climbing, because American climbing has the mystique, the mythology at least, and there's some fact to it too, of having been homegrown, made by American climbers at their crags. Canadian climbing, like Canada generally, had very much of a sense of having been brought here by European climbers, British climbers with the traditions they had, and then climbers from the Eastern Alps. And both of these traditions had fairly strong adventure type ethos. And there was like this sort of sense of, maintaining that. And you still see that on like classic crags like Yamnuska. I think there's a sort of limestone lens. You consider classic routes. Like I took somebody up on a route, a Yosemite climber who's fairly, very good climber, on a route in Yamnuska, and it was like that's going, this is Red Shirt. This is the Mighty Classic. And it's like, how can you call this route classic? There's so much loose rock. It's like, yeah, well, there always is loose rock. There's loose rock in the Dolomites too, right? Traditions in climbing and how you become a climber. Or like, I'm actually not sure anyone really becomes a climber so much as realizes they always were a climber and then starts actually climbing right. Are very important to me. I'm not in any way disrespectful. I was more when I was young, but I'm old and tired and cynical now maybe about it. Not really, but I think that's how you come through traditions and stories to become a climber is something that's always fascinated me.
Yeah, well, the other question, and again, this is like my own, the podcast is my way of like going, doing my pop psychology.
Sure.
A lot of times is, one line I read again was like, trying to beat the boredom of the suburbs. Mm-hmm. And this is in Ontario. And so, I mean, who was this little kid then that, took to climbing versus whatever else you could do to beat the boredom. And I go on about this a lot, that it was just much more difficult to find climbing than it is now. So yeah, what happened there? And then we'll move on to talking about your later life. But I just got to know, like, this little kid who's out riding bikes and doing the things probably that little kids do. And then somewhere in your teens or whatever, this thing popped into your life. And consumed your life. Your whole life has been climbing. I mean, you've published, you write about it, you do it, you continue to climb all the time. So you're a lifer. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, the moment, I guess, well, the actual historical, I guess, dates, which I can't remember, but the events in any case, I went to a camp where they had some climbing, and then I was doing some hiking out on the Niagara Escarpment, which is, if we didn't have that in Southern Ontario, it'd be, the Gunks would be the next place, and it's like an 8-hour drive. But it's about 400 miles long, and much of it is like 20, 30 meter high, overhanging, slightly chossy, but definitely climbable limestone. And because Toronto is this enormous population center, this sort of people end up here, like in New York City, and so no matter what it is you want to end up doing, there's somebody here doing it. And there were some climbers at Rattlesnake Point when I decided, like, just purely out of conceit, that I could climb. I started going out there and figuring it out. And they were there, and George Manson, who had climbed Tissac, and he'd done the nose in a day on Half Dome with Ron Kauk, and all these things, was a truck driver who was married to a woman in Toronto. And then he invited his friends, Greg Cameron, who was a superb climber who free soloed Pipeline at Squamish, 10D off with. And these guys were just kind of here with this, all of the weight of California climbing culture. And, they would like take off for months in the summer and so on. But when they were here, they were like, me and a couple of other friends from the suburbs, it's like there's hardly anyone climbing. So they're welcoming to anyone who's going to belay them, do things, and, the old school of mentoring and climbing, where you got mentored, but you were expected to get smart and increase your skill level very quickly. I had the opportunity to try different things. And there were other climbers around too, here and in the Rockies, when I got out there, who had just a tremendous depth of experience. And the scene was small enough at the time, so that was the opposite. Like, I mean, often if you're an experienced climber, you don't really want to, there's so many people you could mentor now, right? You wouldn't even know where to start. But back then, you showed up at the crag, and if you seemed in any way like you could be assimilated, then you were. And so right. I was lucky to have those contacts and contacts with other climbers who were like super welcoming.
What did your folks think?
They thought I was going to be killed. climbing. And they weren't, they were sort of not really enthusiastic, but also it was very, lower middle class, white neighborhood. Climbing was very white as well at the time. But there was these people that I was climbing with, and my other climbing friends were obviously not going to have an entirely healthy influence on me. I didn't want them to have an entirely healthy influence.
Well, that's
on me
funny
either.
because at those days it came with the counterculture, which is like, smoking weed and drinking and, being rowdy. And, if you weren't climbing, you were probably like, vandalizing something or whatever.
You were behaving like
you
were a deficit to society one way or another.
Well, it's funny because I rode motorcycles as a kid, like motorbikes, dirt bikes and stuff from a really early age. For some crazy reason, I don't even understand to this day. My dad randomly bought me a mini bike when I was in 6th grade, and I would just disappear on it and go off and like and that scene too with the few kids that I would meet up with, most of them older, like teenagers literally, and like I'd go off and if we weren't riding our bikes, somebody had brought beer or cigs or whatever, and it's funny, I think about that with like that era of climbing, like your kid can go off to the ball field and play baseball, or little David was like, okay, I'm out, or not little, I'm sure it was you were a teenager or whatever, but like, okay, I'm out. And then who knows what world that you would go be in for a while and then come back, That's what I imagine anyway.
Well, I think it was like kind of, to me, it was like a non-world where I was coming from too, right? It was like people's aspirations were basically kind of almost non-existent. And then, you kind of eventually go through the looking glass where, especially when you're younger, where climbing is like, you don't really care what it's going to do to your life or to your prospects. Then there's nothing else anyone can really offer you that it's not going to be as good.
Right.
So, I mean, with time, you begin to be able to talk to people who aren't climbers and so on.
I still can't. No. Awesome. Well, that's an awesome background. And again, I'm going to go back and read it now. I wish I'd sort of seen that in your author list, because it sounds fascinating. And
it's
that
in many ways
really
my favorite book to have written.
Yeah.
So
cool. Well, you've gone on, like we mentioned, we won't talk about the story of that because we have other business to get to, but you started Gripped, or was one of the people who started Grip magazine, the print climbing magazine in Canada. You've gone on to be this author. As this youth climber, as this person in the scene, I talked to Dean Fidelman, who was was this like kind of similar position in the Stone Masters, right? He wasn't the mastermind or the spiritual leader, but he was there and he was part of it. And his job or his inclination was to record this era, through photographs. What about you? Did you have like an inclination to have an awareness of like history of what was being done? Did that come later? Like, when did you become this person who was basically recording the history of, in your case, Canadian and North American climbing? Because the loss of sort of print magazines, yours is still printing, but this kind of detriment where we've lost a few of them. People don't realize that is climbing history. Like those magazines for 3 decades were the thing that was recording climbing history, and then once a year the Alpine journals came out or whatever. But where did that inclination come from, and did you have it back then?
I think the inclination for me came out of a sense that something was originally very important was happening to me and to the people around me. And it was in some ways a conceit, and in other ways we were inventing climbing as we went along. And if you were involved in early sport climbing, it was the same thing. You were inventing an activity and its practices, its mythologies, its values as you went along. And I had that sense from the start, which was why I think I was interested in climbing guidebooks, which, like, when I look back, they were sort of diaries of little communities of people as much as anything.
Yeah, and historical records as well. I failed to mention that one.
Yeah.
But they were very much dedicated to recording history as much as giving information about how to climb a route.
They were much more informal and sometimes even coded in some ways so that it was difficult to actually do what they were describing. And so as I got older and I saw the different vectors of people's lives who I climbed with, where they ended up, some of them did incredible things in climbing. Many just sort of dropped out. And I started to become interested in our stories as people. And I have always been fascinated with original records of climbers, whether it's these people I've written about or like what it was we wrote when we thought no one was necessarily going to come and read it and analyze it. Not out of any curiosity. I have some of that, but mostly because it matters so much to me, like how it mattered to people who did incredible things. Really, it's affecting. And I think our story just, any effort that can be put into understanding it better. Whenever you write, you can write for a whole lifetime, as Germaine Greer said, and shine the light on something small, which is what I try to do.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you've got 3 biographies: Paul Preuss, Emilio Camici, and now Royal Robbins. And is that the order in which you wrote those?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, very much.
That's what I thought, because that's the order I read them in.
Yeah.
And the current, the newest book, the one that just came out really from the Mountaineers is the Royal Robbins book, American Climber, and The American Climber, sorry. And it kind of struck me that one, it's a more modern figure in history. He's only, he passed not too long ago. Is definitely a current figure, someone that we could have talked to. And actually, part of this interview is an interview that I have with Royal Robbins, versus those other 2 that are historical figures, long gone, and also from an era where maybe getting records and finding out personal thoughts could be quite difficult. And I think in particular with Camici, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but his background, again, working class, not the type of person who's necessarily prolific with writing journals and things like that. Plus his era, it ended right before the World War II, and Italian history shifted so hard, and in a lot of ways, I think they did a lot of work post World War II to almost get rid of at least that part of their history. That's sort of something we would go down a rabbit hole with. But so, can you talk about the projects comparing someone, sort of researching someone like Royal Robbins, more modern, and researching these figures that are a little bit more lost to the past, and what you had to bring to that as a researcher and an author?
I think in the case of, obviously, like, Royal died not that long ago, and he knew, one can speak to many people who he knew, although people from the golden age of Yosemite climbing, as they call 1957 to 1969, same era as the space race, certainly, are dying too. They're getting older, and like Glenn Denny died after I interviewed him, and so on. So I think the opportunity to speak to people who actually knew Royal was an enormous opportunity to get people's thoughts and so on about it, like people who knew him really well, like even people who were in high school with him. That was really a benefit I didn't have as much with the other publications, or I didn't have at all, with the exception of having presented the Camici book in Belluno, and then being presented with a telephone with a 102-year-old Renato Sanuti on the other end, who at 16 had spent a day climbing with Camici. So I think
amazing, really. Just one day.
I was like, because someone had asked me, I'd been set up for it, but it's interesting you ask about youth wasted climbing, because that book finds people who love it, and I've been even asked questions about it in Italy and so on.
Oh, nice.
When I was supposed to be talking about Camici. Yeah, in a sense, Royal is more relatable. And certainly like the fact that he just was a compulsive writer and recorder of things he did on the daily basis. Like tens of thousands of documents exist, made it richer background. Royal, he comes up in a more like the more relatable 1960s kind of context, and then the grade system, preoccupation with free climbing, clean climbing, the idea that you travel to do a boulder problem. Like Royal, besides John Gill, who was sort of playing his own game at the time, Royal was the only person I'd ever heard of who heard there was a boulder problem halfway across the country and got in a car and drove there to try to do it. Speaking of the thimble, of course, and the needles. But so yeah, those contexts are they're different.
Well, also you were dealing with a figure, what there's a bunch of writing about already.
Mm-hmm.
Pat Ament has a biography that came out, I don't know, must have been in my 20s. So quite a long time ago, The Spirit of the Age. Royal had his own autobiography that he was working on volumes when he passed away.
Yeah.
And I believe had 3 out or 2. So you had a lot of stuff, from the person, you had stuff about him. But the thing I enjoyed about your book about the American climber is I think you did a really good job of a little bit of myth breaking, if you will, or allowing Royal's weaknesses to come through in a lot of ways, and the contradictions in his life to come through, as opposed to, not that he avoided them necessarily in his books, but the previous writing to me, it seemed a lot like more, what's the word? Is it hagiography? Is that the word I'm looking for? Like, kind of building the myth, building his own myth, and just creating this giant that we have in our minds in climbing. And I loved the fact that yours wasn't disrespectful in any way, but showed the man, the real person, a lot more, I think, than anything I had read. So how did you go about sort of thinking about that as far as your writing and what you wanted to accomplish with your book versus just another telling of the great story of the great man that we've heard so many times?
With all of these things, I sort of gather everything I possibly can. Like, so I know what the legends are about these people, and there were a lot of them about Royal. And then I look at what I can find in terms of any other information, things they said to people, what the timing of it was relative to, the big climbs or other events of their lives. And, I'll speak to, in Royal's case, spoke to many people, like, what did you actually think about him? And you begin to realize too, that there's different understandings of who a climber was, a great climber, based on what your relationship to that person is. Great climbers are often described, by people they climbed with who were their friends, or people who were never really top climbers themselves, as often as majestic, could not fall, moved, in this sort of extremely smooth manner. The Preuss was described that way by lots of people he climbed with, or who saw him climb, who were actually not very good climbers, or not in any way at his level, but people who climbed with him who could climb at his level, like Tita Piaz, said, well, he took a lot of chances, he looked pretty shaky to me, and so on. And then the same is true with Royal. To really understand Royal as a top climber, you have to talk to people who were climbing at his level with him in his group. And they obviously are going to humanize things somewhat, because they see him trying his hardest at stuff that all of them can just barely accomplish. But I don't set out in any way to do anything but to create as accurate as possible image of a life, right? A life is a basic unit of storytelling. And I think these people, I think the poet Auden said, the truly great won't care what angle we look at them from, right? And these are public figures. We deserve to know. Somebody who, for me, it's I really wanted to go to Yosemite and climb the northwest face of Half Dome. It preoccupied me. I had to try it twice to get up there. And the first time I was just too freaked out to do it. And then, the nose and the Salothe. And that's my big wall climbing career in 2 sentences. Walking in the footsteps of these people, like we build our lives around the legends, not just the legends, but things that they create that become absolutely important monuments of our own existence. I think we're entitled to have some insight into who they really were. Now, that being said, I've tended to ignore people in the climbing scene, or not ignore them anyway, but not want to write about people who I know are like fundamentally awful. Right? And, Preuss and Komichi and Royal, 3 total greats in the history of climbing, didn't have any horrible personal flaws, right? And I think in some ways, like where you get into this kind of problems with this is like not accepting that everyone has a life where they struggle to, differentiate themselves from their parents, find out how they want to spend time in their life, figure out things with love and romances and all this stuff. And so I was just trying to portray Royal as richly and as accurately as I believe that I was able to do. And he's a figure like, every 20 years, there's a new 600-page biography of Beethoven. I'm not sure the climbing market wants a 600-page biography of anybody, but someone else 20 years from now will have other insights for sure.
Did you ever meet Royal?
I did not. I might have, but I did not.
What do you mean by you might have?
Well, I mean, I was at trade shows where he was there.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So curiously, our paths never crossed. And I regret it because every single person I ever talked to who met Royal, no one says, yeah, I met him. Next question. Everyone has a little story about their meeting with him. So I wish I had done. Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like to have a good, well, maybe I'm wrong about this, but having not written a biography of anyone, so although I do a lot of biography on here, I think, but we meet, and oftentimes, this show started with literally interviewing my friends, because they would agree to do a podcast, which nobody knew what that was or anything. Sure. So I just said, no, just trust me, come to my house and we'll do this thing. But I almost feel like your remoteness from it, in a sense, although it's not truly remote, because again, his life affected your life in so many ways. At least what he did, his work, the works of his life, might be a positive in that sense of coming at it with a clean slate. Is that like off base, or don't think it would have mattered had you interacted a fair amount with Royal over the years, the way like a Michael Kennedy had, as the publisher of Climbing Magazine? He could also write a biography. I mean, he's certainly capable of that kind of writing, but it would be a very different perspective.
Well, I feel very much like it just depends. I think a lot of the kind of biographical stuff that is written by people, if you know somebody and you're very close to them, then that's not just biography, it's also memoir, it's also engaged on that level, which doesn't take anything at all away from it. But, the notion that knowing somebody really well will make you their ideal biographer, it's like history is full of examples that show that it's not true, right? I mean, obviously, Donald Trump's closest friends will not write the most accurate biography of Donald Trump, but what they do write will offer insight into his circle, his friendships, how people saw him. And then that becomes part of the primary material for a more objective inquiry. But
yeah. So one of the things I was kind of surprised at is how messy sort of the ethics and bolt wars and things like that were, because we have these kind of very boxed stories, right, where, people would put bolts in and Royal would chop them. And then the one, story where he started chopping the dawn wall and stopped, and, these very set things. But obviously reading that book and you got into some details, it was a lot messier, and even Royal's ethics were a little more fuzzy than sort of the myth or the stories that I have in my head, including, the fact that in these paragraphs would like pop up and then disappear in the book, where he would place a bolt on a second ascent, of like the mirror wall or whatever. And I was just like, read back, I was like, what? Like, I thought this guy was like a complete turnaround or bust or whatever. But there was a lot of things where he sort of let things slide or broke some of his own rules, and made me realize how you mentioned earlier how with sport climbing you guys were making it up. All the initial sport climbers in these pockets around, especially in North America, which was late to the game compared to Europe, were sort of just making it up, and they were making it up as well. But then the myth became that it was already decided, and they had their stances and they were in their groups and their camps. What about you? How deep was your knowledge of that history, and were you coming at it too from sort of sort of a pop culture kind of knowledge of what supposedly happened via, Valley Uprising and things like that?
No, I was not coming at it from the point of view of what happened, what they recorded in Valley Uprising, which I loved, by the way.
Yeah.
But
Royal did not, though.
Yeah, exactly. But, I didn't know all of the details, and some of the sort of more nuanced stories, like Michael Covington and Royal on, the prow, where they're sort of going through the bottom of the barrel of walls, and like the next walls are either going to be super thin seams connected by bolt ladders, or they're not even going to do them. And Royal is like, this is the next path, right? And like on Tissac, whatever it was, 110 bolts. Someone should check that number, but like a lot of bolts. Mm-hmm. And Royal was like, I'm going to write my name on the wall forever. And in a way, I guess he'd already done that with the Northwest face, but, he was determined to go up on Tissac and do it, even though there were large sections that had to be bolted. But he himself wasn't shy about it. He didn't obscure the fact that these things had happened, and the clarity with which people sort of ascribed him to like being utterly against it. He didn't feel the need to have that himself. And also, like, you get people in climbing history like Paul Preuss, if you weight the rope to rappel, you're allowed to do that, to descend and fail if you want, but the climb is totally invalid. If you use one piton, the climb is totally invalid. Like Preuss said, I'm not interested in the discussion they have in, the sandstone towers near Dresden of whether, 2 or 3 bolts should be allowed, because it's a wrong-minded discussion, because as soon as you use one, you totally invalidate the climb. So there are people like that in history, but Royal and these guys, they're not.
He must have been fun to be around.
He was supposedly, he was
okay, cool.
A hilarious, fun guy.
Okay, cool.
But climbing, I think he was not, right? But, he could be not fun to climb. But in Royal's case, they're trying to do something totally unprecedented. These climbs on Yosemite walls, there's nothing else like in the world. They're figuring it out. And because he spoke about these things at all, and he was working out what are we going to do about this stuff? What are the ethics, the approaches? He had to say in some idealized form what the rules were going to be. And then Harding delighted in portraying himself as the absolute opposite of everything Royal wanted to do, when in fact they were doing things that were pretty similar, right? In many ways, right? So it became kind of a caricature. I don't think Royal participated that much in it, but he was actually quite amused by Harding's book, Downward Bound, in which he's portrayed like in caricature for rules. And Harding and Royal, in their own way, they stayed friends.
That's. I mean, when I just quipped that Royal didn't like that part of Valley Uprising, anyways, that it was too simplified, and that he was close with Harding and respected Harding and was friends with Harding. And yet, it's interesting that you talk about the Downward Bound book, Harding's, very satirical product of the age, the style, and everything else. But it's interesting because that was satire, but that became what we think of as Royal Robbins in reality. And it's sort of fascinating how something that small or amusing could become such this critical part of the myth building. Because like the whole Valley Christians thing and is something that it's in my head. And when I see pictures of Royal, and oftentimes they're very, he's like rubbing his chin at the chessboard and everything else. It's like it all fits. And even though I now know it's not true, it's almost like I can't get rid of it. I can't get rid of this like sort of staunch preaching, guy marching around Yosemite trying to like get everybody to follow his lead. But that certainly wasn't the case. And it's also fascinating that there's so many times when it's talked about how shy he was and how sort of unwilling to get on these pulpits that he was, at least outwardly, if not in his private writings.
I think he became the Royal Robbins of history, right? He was somebody who, he had a look, a sort of a swagger. He was aware of his place in history. He evinced that in photographs. He was well aware of the importance of the image, and he was sort of, in terms of what he did and what he proposed to do and so on, his transformative effect on world climbing was absolutely incredible. Like Yosemite is a place that when he gets there, there's one hard climb, the Stek Salathe, as it's now known, and Royal walks up to Alan Stek and says, he's 17 years old or something. Says to Stek, "Oh, is there anything worth climbing around here?" And there was, but a lot of it had to be thought up and done, and people like Joe Fitchin and Glenn Denny, Chouinard say it was Royal's ideas were crucial to these things happening. Royal said, "We can do this. We'll do it this way," and he couldn't have done it all himself, but by doing that, he sort of bequeathed these climbs that are still mostly the climbs that, if you go to Yosemite, I was there for the facelift this year, and you go there and you look up on El Cap. Most of the people are on the Salathe and the nose, right? Like people, they want to come, they want to do Royal's routes in many ways still. Yes, there's a lot of people elsewhere, but these are still the great lines that people want to follow in. So
part of like this myth building or whatever, Royal kind of had this demeanor, especially late in life, of sort of inhabiting these things we're talking about, right? Yeah. He learned to public speak, and I think there's something in there about how like once he learned to public speak, that became his voice, where his friends would call him and not even recognize who was on the phone because he had learned to orate, and he would orate on the phone and things. So he came to inhabit that, and it was part of his business. His business was literally named after him, Royal Robbins, the clothing company. And so I'm sure the family kind of like fell into this, sort of holding up this thing. You go in there and you want all the writings. They give them to you. And again, we talk about, creating this image of the man that sort of, if not, it just like looks deeper than that image. What was it like to work with the family and have them allow you to go a little deeper than some of these other things that had happened? Some of these other things that had been written, and get to put it in a word, just get more personal about.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Writing biography, it's as I was saying, it's using a human life or choosing as your framework a human life, the most basic form of storytelling, and then you're also connecting with other people, whether they're, archivists, or, in the case of Preuss, there were even like family members and so on. And yeah, the people who Royal was closest to of all were his family. Liz is an absolutely extraordinary climber person, his kids, Tamara and Damon. And their stories about Royal were, they were intense. You grow up in a family, like as climbers, we go like, well, nothing could be more important than that issue of whether Royal added a bolt to the expanding flake, Texas flake, whatever. But actually, you raise children, and that's shines a light on a whole other host of weaknesses and so on. Or you live with somebody for your entire life, like their entire life, like Liz lived with Royal. So I welcomed that, and I welcomed that input. And when you say I got to see everything, I think that it would be that would be an arrogant claim. Sure. But a lot of people, the family and Steve Roper and so on, provided me with all kinds of like interactions they'd had with him. But I don't think that there was like this notion that Royal would have wanted or ought to have been protected from whatever, if you want to call it scrutiny that I would have. I don't think it was shared at all by the family or people who were closest to him. And certainly the impression I got from Liz is Royal just, if anything, just didn't really care what people thought about what he said or did. Not in some horrible sense, but that he was a kind of a man unto himself in many ways. And they were sometimes, I would talk to them about things I was going to say, and they would go, no, that's not what happened. This happened, and their story would be, less flattering. Because I think they realized how huge Royal was for climbing, American climbing in particular, but world climbing. And, they wanted people to get an accurate view of him. I mean, of course, personality flaws like Leo Comici had, whereas you're a fascist. Royal didn't have any. Right. There weren't any stories like that. But that's one of the challenges. And then navigating between what your understanding of the story is and what other people had. But like in terms of the family, the only things they ever told me I got wrong were just factual. I never once was told by them, don't say this or don't say that. Right. Unless it was like when, this didn't happen that way, or somebody, with some of these stories, it's like who won the chess game by Columbia Boulder that day, and did this or that really happen? And like in a number of cases, like Liz, who was there, was able to just say, well, I was there, that didn't happen. There were a couple of times where somebody was driving a car and they tried to climb some mud pillar or something, and the cops came, and I had at one point 3 different people telling me they drove the car when the cops came. Right. You can either say 3 people said this, or you can work out who you think the driver was. So these are the challenges of biography.
Right. This part of the discussion sort of brings me to my dilemma of 10 years, which is going to be part of this show, is that quite a few years ago, not long, I think it was just the summer after I started the podcast, which was about 6 months into it only, I had a chance to interview Royal Robbins at the Lander International Climbing Festival. And I've had this interview that I have been sitting on for kind of reasons that we might get into here. I sat down with him in Lander for about 30, I think it was about a total of about 40 minutes, maybe about 35 of that on recording, and came home with an interview that I decided to shelve. And I decided to shelve it for a bunch of different reasons. And it has a little bit to do with the last chapters of your book as well, and kind of the very sort of nadir of Royal's life, dealing with some illness that was affecting him physically. And I kind of interviewed him right, I think it feels like right when those things were starting to surface. I think it's a little bit apparent in my interview, although looking back at it or listening to it again and sending it to you, I think I was sort of overblowing that in my head. But can we talk a little bit about the end of Royal's life as you wrote about it, and then we can talk a little bit about this interview before we cue it up for the end of this show.
Towards the end of Royal's life, he had a rare sort of neurodegenerative disease, but he had been partway through his biography writing process when it kind of began to kick in, and it's like slowly deprived him of capacity to move around, eventually to speak. And he was strong and fit still when this happened. It was a great tragedy, but he dealt with it very stoically. To some degree, you can sort of see, listening to the interview you have, that his like earlier, the speed with which he could respond and so on is decreased to some degree, but his memory of things is still excellent. But yeah, and it eventually took his life. But if he hadn't been stricken with this disease, he probably would have lived quite a long time, because he was notoriously strong and healthy living guy.
And it's, as we've been talking, and we talked on the phone right after I sent you the interview, one thing that comes through in there, well, let me say this. One of the reasons I had this dilemma is because I went into the interview with all these myths and this image of Royal that I had from climbing and from following him and from idolizing him. I have a signed copy of Spirit of the Age. My patron saint was Core, but those guys were contemporaries and respected each other, and Royal respected Core a great deal. So I went into this interview with all of that, and I wasn't very good at interviewing yet, I don't think. And also, when I sat down, I immediately got really nervous because I was like, okay, that's not what I'm going to get. I'm not going to get this guy firing. But the truth is that I got what I got because he's Royal Robbins. And what comes through in your book too, and you were talking about him not caring about what other people thought of him, is he doesn't play along with my interview. Which also, as like a novice interviewer, like put me back on my heels as well, because he was like, yeah, I have to do this thing, and I'm going to give this kid compared to him, what I'm going to give him, but that's it, And so it's funny now to listen to it and hear me kind of like stuttering a bit, like, okay, well, that one didn't work or whatever. But also, like, I got home and I was like, I don't know, without context, if this is like going to serve Royal to put this out into the world to climbers who had never heard of him or don't understand like the immense figure that he is. And that was kind of my reason for shelving it, was more that than my embarrassment about how I interviewed him. Because I was, that were all my interviews were like that then, and still are. I mean, here I am stumbling through this. So, and the other thing that had happened, and I want to put this in context too, is that when I had told Michael Kennedy and Julie Kennedy, I was excited to go talk to Royal, and they knew him and blah, blah, blah. Michael had actually given me a little bit of a heads up. He had said to me, like, yeah, we'd seen Royal over the last couple of years, and sometimes it's the old Royal, and sometimes there's, this indication of something going on, and we're not totally sure what it is. And I don't think they were being very public at all. I mean, it probably wasn't public at all. And that was the other thing that I had kind of a feeling about, is that having that a little bit indicated in this interview, am I like invading his privacy by putting it out? But when I read the book, and I was like, here's this book that can put this man in context and help us realize who I'm actually talking to. It started to get me excited to put the interview out, and I think it's going to be a great addendum to this. But I don't know if you have any comments on that, on what I encountered there across the table with Royal and what was true and to his spirit, because I think there is a lot of stuff in there that's true to his spirit.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting to listen to what you have to say about it. I mean, it's progressive supranuclear palsy, I believe is the correct name of the disease. And like it's mysterious. Not many people have suffered from it. And from what I heard from the family, he had sometimes when he was like, he could, speak very, very clearly, and other times he just didn't really want to, or couldn't. But I think he's very clear on, you ask him questions, he answers them. In some ways, he sort of, in some interviews from earlier than that, like 10, 15 years before that, he is more the public speaker. And in your interview with him, he's more the clipped kind of, here's the answer, and that's that. Like, I think at one point in the interview, he more or less says, that's it.
He literally says
after
that's
he
it.
answers a question.
And I kind of reduced the long pause after that, by the way, like, because I sat there and I was like, okay, like, come on, like, give me something a little bit more. Yeah, so that was just, sorry to elaborate on that, but that is a kind of wild part of the interview. And again, having read your book, I was like, oh, no, he really was just done.
Yeah. Well, I think he'd been asked a lot of these questions a lot before. Not many of us get asked the same questions about one thing about our life sort of as often as Royal would have. And so there was that. But, I think it wasn't at all a bad interview. Like when you look at other interviews that Royal did earlier on, I mean, there were other interviewers that certainly managed to piss him off a lot more than you did.
Oh, that would have withered me. They would have had to like take me out in a body bag if I had pissed him off. Like, yeah, I'm not the guy I am now as far as, although I wouldn't want to piss off Royal Robbins to this day. But yeah, no, that would have been a pretty miserable experience for me. To have like my idol get angry at me because I'm being stupid.
Yeah, I think he was resolved to continue with the autobiography process until like very late in the onset of his disease. So I think it was also one of these things where it made it harder to speak and to elucidate answers than it did to understand what you were being asked. So
yeah, I mean, and it kind of my uncle, passed from Lou Gehrig's, and that, that with that particular disease, it's your mind is fine and your body's betraying you and you can't, you can no longer express yourself, which increases your frustration. And, I just watched that all happen in real time and it's very difficult. And I don't think it's quite the same with this, but it was clear that expressing himself was a bit exhausting. And the interview was a little bit exhausting. And actually Liz kind of ended it. She was in the room, which also made me freaking nervous. And she, very politely and casually ended it, but also I think realizing that, it was done and it had been somewhat difficult or whatever. And physically leaving the room and coming into the room too, there was something that was happening, which like I'd only sort of been told, by Michael kind of mentioning it. So as again, this guy who's ready for his idol to walk into the room, it was a little bit difficult for me. So all those things wrapped up, but now, like you said, I've listened to it, I re-edited it, and I'm like, there is this thing there that's still an essence, and I think it's still a good piece to put into the historical record.
Yeah, and I think we still need to be talking, thinking about listening to and talking about Royal because he's so central to the story of climbing.
The following interview with Royal Robbins was recorded in July of 2012 at the International Climbers Festival in Lander, Wyoming. Welcome to the Enormocast. I am sitting across the table from Royal Robbins, and I'd like to thank Royal for coming and sitting down with me. And at the risk of embarrassing myself and Mr. Robbins here, as my introduction, I started climbing 20-some years ago, which is a drop in the bucket for you, but in an era sort of pre-sport climbing, and when I first started climbing, one of my guys was Leighton Core because I was from Colorado, and I was a big fan, and I read a lot about Core, but you were right there behind him in terms of one of the guys that I admired, even though you had been climbing, even 20 years before I had, or 30. And I just want to sort of put that out there as my philosophy in climbing as I went up through becoming better and better. The things that you taught the world about climbing were very much in the forefront of my mind in terms of clean climbing and the spirit of adventure and all those sorts of things. And you obviously have no way of knowing this, but you signed your biography for me about 18 years ago at an event, which was a really special moment for me. And I appreciate that. But again, thanks for coming and sitting down.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted to ask you about when you were climbing back in those quote unquote golden age of Yosemite climbing.
I like that word, golden age.
You know, you guys had created this philosophy, or at least you were proponents of this clean climbing philosophy and this spirit of adventure. And you were about to tell me a little bit about the influence that John Salathe had on you.
Well, Salathe was very influential on us because he climbed in a way that we wish we had done that. That is to say, he didn't use expansion bolts except when they were absolutely necessary, and he free climbed at a marvelous standard. Way above what we were doing without protection, and pretty impressive. So we always wanted to climb like John Salathe, and we named the Salathe Wall on El Capitan after him. That was Yvon Chouinard's idea. Right.
And so when you say we, you know, I personally happen to know some of the characters from my delving into history, but we're talking about Chouinard and Pratt and Tom Frost and,
yes,
and those names and anyone else that you'd like to sort of put in that group.
Though there's the other names I would put in the group, though they didn't have anything to do with our admiration of Salathe, was Leighton Core. We called him Leighton the Greaton because he was the guy who came not from Yosemite, not from California, but from outside, and he came to Yosemite and he climbed everything in sight at a rapid rate. Yeah,
and I guess that was probably really unusual, maybe shocking for you guys to have somebody not of your little core group to come in and show you what was being done maybe elsewhere too.
It was shocking, yes.
But you guys went on to have a pretty prolific career together, you and Core.
We did.
Yeah.
I had great admiration for Core. I still do.
So you actually just mentioned free climbing that John Salathe was doing. So was that something that, you know, you guys recognized as obviously a style to kind of push yourself towards and away from sort of artificial climbing away?
Well, I don't think we saw it as separate from artificial climbing as such. It's just that what Salathe did in the, I think in Pinnacles National Monument, climbed something called the Hand there, and he went so far out with protection that these days I'm happy to have it.
All right.
And so we were very impressed by his free climb ability, but also his solo of the Arrowhead Tip, where he almost got to the top. And he did that solo. And in those days, you just didn't do that sort of thing.
And this was even in the 50s.
It was in the 50s.
Late 50s, right?
No, I think it was in the 40s.
Oh, it was in the 40s.
Yes.
Okay. So you came up, you know, I've read the biography by Pat Ament, and looking at your past, you came up through Boy Scouting. Is that where you ended up learning to climb?
Yes.
In
yes,
California.
That's right. In the Sierra Nevada, yes.
And then do you remember when you first started, you know, when you first started climbing, and also from reading from reading the biography, you know, you had a less than perfect childhood. I'll just leave it at that, and people can go and find those books and read them, and the ones you're working on now, which we'll talk about. But do you have a moment? You're a very self-aware man now. Did you have a moment where you saw this climbing thing as maybe something that was going to be your future?
Not in that sense, but right. I had a moment when I said to myself, climbing is it. That's what I want to do. I want to be like these pictures I'd seen of climbers who were apparently unafraid. Apparently.
And was that something that you were doing, was conquering some fears or wanting to feel more secure? In what
I think I was
doing?
Conquering fears, yes.
And what the name of your newest book is To Be Brave. And does that speak to this idea of seeing these guys that appear
I think
to be
so.
fearless?
I wanted to be brave, and I thought everybody wants to be brave. So I would title of that. Mm-hmm. So yes, and it comes from a picture I saw in James Ramsey Ullman's High Conquest.
Okay.
Of a climber on the steep rock face, but you can't put it into words. You have to say some different words.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So To Be Brave captures it.
Another question I saw, or something I contemplate, is that so much of what this group of guys primarily, but including Liz, your wife at the time, but what you guys were doing, this group of people in the golden age, has become so significant in terms of American rock climbing and worldwide rock climbing. When you were doing it, did you guys have a sense of this? Did you feel sort of a weight of the maybe future importance of what you were up to?
No, we didn't. We didn't have any sense of it. But I'm very happy to hear that that we were set a certain standard that is looked up to. So I'm very happy about that. But we didn't have any idea that we were doing anything of the sort.
Sure. Well, it's awesome you're laughing about that, because when I look at pictures of you in that era, you know, some of the clothes are a little bit different, not that much different, and obviously the gear's different, but I always just feel like, yeah, you could simply transpose those pictures to modern times, and you were just another generation of the rest of us in that time. So I that was my question, like, did they know what they were up to?
No, we didn't know.
Right.
We didn't know, but I wanted to be like Gaston Rebouffat, mm-hmm. Who was always very photogenic.
Sure.
And very good.
Well, a little quick aside, when the first time I went to Yosemite, this was the 90s, but I was prone to wearing because of pictures of Ray Northcutt and Leighton Core.
No.
This is how much of a nerd I was. I was prone to wearing a 50s style flat top. Uh-huh. And I was in the Camp 4 parking lot, and this guy came up to me and he said, "You know who you look like?" Because I had glasses like these. And I said, "Who?" He's like, "You look like Royal Robbins." And then he called all his buddies over and said, "Look at this guy. He looks like Royal Robbins." And I said, "Yes, perfect. I look like Royal Robbins." So as an honor to you, sir.
Well, thank you.
But again, like, this feeling of connection to your generation is something I think all climbers that walk into Yosemite have to feel.
Well, I feel going into Yosemite every time, I feel like it's the first time. I've never been there before. It's such a wonderful place. Mm. Amazing.
And you live in Modesto, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So
about 2.5 hours from Yosemite.
So you get there occasionally then still.
Well, not for climbing,
right.
But for the Yosemite Conservancy, mm-hmm. we go there.
During this time when, you know, the South Bay was created and North American Wall and that era, were you a relatively permanent resident in the valley?
In the spring and fall, we were relatively permanent, but mm-hmm. we left in the summer to come to places like Wyoming or Colorado, or occasionally to South Dakota, mm-hmm. Because it was cooler.
Oh, right.
And we thought, well, let's get away from this heat, and we could also go to the Tuolumne Meadows, mm-hmm. and be up in the Sierra, mm-hmm. where it's cooler too.
One thing too, researching your history. Not that I had to; I kind of knew it. But right away in your history, there's this amazing woman standing with you, Liz, your wife.
Yeah.
And how long have you guys been together?
Well, we've been together since, I think, 1961, okay. And we got married in 1963, okay. November.
Can you sum up the connection you had with her through climbing and how she sort of influenced you as a person and as a climber? I mean, that's a big question, I know, but...
Sum it up, no. All I say is that she had a profound influence on me, mm-hmm. and she still does. Mm-hmm. She's very smart and usually right, mm-hmm. when I'm usually wrong.
Right. And you guys, you met in Yosemite. How did you meet?
I think we met in Yosemite. Yes. Mm-hmm. She was working at the Ahwahnee Hotel.
Okay.
And came over to a Teton Tea Party with a well, we call him a closet climber. He was a good-looking fellow who also worked for the Curry Company. And at that time, Curry employees were not allowed to fraternize with climbers.
Okay, that's probably a good policy in general.
It probably is.
Nevertheless, sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
You're right.
So she shows up at the party.
And I was quite taken by her. I remember that Herb and I walked her home, which was a ways, because at that time, as I explained in my book, she was being stalked by a fellow member of the Curry Company, and he didn't like the idea that she was so free with her charms.
Right. Okay. So you walked her home.
So we walked her home, and I got in an argument with this guy who was there, and the argument didn't lead anywhere. But I told Herb, well, you can always count on me. Didn't tell him what that meant, but I said so, and he was happy to hear it. So I let it go at that.
Right.
That's about it.
Yeah. And then you guys started seeing each other, or you? Well,
we started seeing each other. Yeah, she started coming to Camp 4, and I thought, well, I'll ask this girl out. So I didn't know about movies, and I didn't know how to dance, so I asked her to climbing.
Oh, right.
So we went up into the Tuolumne Meadows and climbed the southeast buttress of Cathedral Peak, and that was her first climb.
Amazing,
a walk-in.
And you were that was it. You were smitten.
That was it.
Right.
That was it.
And you managed to convince her too.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love that story because it happens to this day again and again and again. And maybe it doesn't result in what you guys have, but the idea of a climber, seeing a gal who's working at the Curry Company now, the concessionaire in Yosemite, and what do all climbers, the only thing they've got is, hey, do you want to go climbing?
Yeah.
And, most of the time it doesn't work out that well, but for you guys, it apparently has.
Most of the time it doesn't. You're right.
Right. So that's an awesome story because, again, it's sort of timeless. We can put it to today. It happened this weekend, I'm sure, to somebody in Yosemite. So, and the two of you went on to form a climbing school in Europe. In Lausanne, is that right?
We started one in California when we came back from Europe. But in Europe, we became part of the International School of Modern Mountaineering, which was started by John Harlan Sr. And he also was the sports director at the American High School there in Lausanne. And he gave up his post there so he could concentrate on climbing the Eiger by direct route in winter. And we took his place,
right?
Liz and I.
Right.
So we became sports directors of the American high school there.
How long did you stay over in Europe then?
Total of 2 years.
Okay.
From 65 to 67.
And then did you end up coming back to Yosemite?
Yes, we came back to Modesto, which meant Yosemite.
And just to put it in history, is that John went on and ended up being killed on the Eiger.
Yes.
In the direct.
And his son is the editor of the Alpine Journal now.
So, there's kind of a period, and I wanted to ask you real quick about it. We don't have to cover it all, but where I sort of lost track as well. But you ended up, in the late 70s, you ended up becoming a kayaker, which I'd like to get to for just a minute. But so, what were your primary motivations, through the early 70s? Climbing around the world? Were you, what was going on?
I was trying to, what they call tidy up.
Okay.
A little bit.
To finish your tick list in terms of some of the big climbs that you wanted to do around the world? It was
smaller climbs by that time. Hooker was the big one.
Okay.
In the Wind River Range here. And but in the early 70s, we tended to do short, hard climbs in Tuolumne Meadows with Chris Vandiver, and also in Colorado.
Right, and this is the era when you really were concentrating on advancing free climbing and advancing this idea of of clean climbing in terms of protection as well.
I think the 70s is accurate, yes.
Yeah. So because that's one thing I think I say I missed it, but you're so known for these big walls. You're so known for the South Day. You're so known for the North American Wall and some of these other things that you did. But looking at your free climbing record, and perhaps because it was smaller routes, but Roy Robbins was someone who was advancing that pretty consistently all the way through the 70s, as Jim Erickson was in Colorado and some of your contemporaries were. But you're right in there. I mean, even in Boulder Canyon and around Boulder, there's some very difficult first ascents that you did, including Athlete's Feet up on Country Club Crack.
Country Club Crack, yes.
Yeah, up on Country Club, next to Country Club Crack, which anybody Boulder listeners will know that it's an exceedingly difficult few moves on that climb that you freed quite a long time ago. So,
I guess I was with a guy who pushed me, Pat Ament. He was. I seemed to squeeze it out when he was around.
Right. That's excellent. Yeah, Pat went on to write a biography of you.
Yes, he did.
Spirit of the Age. So that's one thing that people can look up to find out a little bit more about you. So moving on, so you ended up becoming a big descent kayaker through the late 70s and onward. Was there a distinct transition, or is it something that you kind of fell into with another interest?
I think there was a distinct transition.
Okay.
Because I had to give up climbing because of arthritis in my wrists and ankles.
Okay.
And so I could boat. Once I got into the kayak, it was okay.
Mm-hmm. And was it something where you found some of the same fulfillment as you'd gotten from climbing?
Yes, in doing first.
Right, doing first descents throughout the Sierras.
And throughout the Sierras and South America.
For me, I find climbing to be so slow, especially big wall climbing. And then kayaking is so fast and reactive to the water that my brain doesn't wrap around it very well. But it's not. It seems like you
climbing is
right
different.
Into it.
Climbing is very different. I think in climbing you go more slowly. You're right, but usually you have a second chance, and in kayaking you don't have a second chance. I guess it's the opposite. In climbing, if you without a rope you don't have a second chance, and in kayaking you might take a nasty swim, but you might survive and you might not. So you always have a chance. So it's climbing is my first love because. Well, in a sense, it demands more of you, and so I always like that about climbing.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I guess because it's slower than kayaking, you have to squeeze out more of yourself.
Okay,
that's all I can say about. That's a good question, though. I don't know what the answer is.
As a person who thinks about these things, and I have plenty of friends who do other sports, that can be dangerous or whatever. And so I'm always wondering kind of what makes one different from the next. And I just know for myself that kayaking seems terrifying to me. And the fact that you have a rope in climbing and most of the time a fall or whatever isn't that big a deal. But with kayaking, it seems like every time you swim, it can go from okay to bad very quickly. Very quickly. And anytime. On a sunny, warm day, no matter what. So I guess that's sort of maybe, again, my why I'm impressed is that someone that can do both,
Well, I was impressed I could do both too. They are very different, right. But they also have similarities. Mm-hmm. In that they're both serious.
So you and Liz started Royal Robbins, your clothing company, about 30 years ago. Is that
in 1968? Oh,
well, it's been around that long.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you approach that sort of thing, I mean, this is kind of maybe a little bit of a cliche question, but as someone who's an entrepreneur or as a businessman or business person. Is there things from climbing that you sort of brought to the table in terms of how you approached creating a business? That's I mean, it's quite a large business now, and sells clothes all over the world, and is obviously your livelihood. So what did you bring? Is there anything you brought from climbing to approach that?
I would say that the only thing I was conscious of bringing from climbing is perseverance.
Mm-hmm.
You keep trying and keep at something, you're eventually going to probably succeed.
Right.
But it takes a lot out of you to keep trying.
Right.
It's much easier to give up.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So at least with, I think probably with a business and with climbing, there's a level of commitment that keeps you going along as well. I mean, when you're halfway up El Cap, sometimes it's easier to keep going up than to go down. And when you've invested, time, money, and sweat into a business, it's probably gets increasingly more difficult to walk away.
It probably does. Yeah. I don't know.
I asked you as a preliminary to this if you sort of kept up with modern climbing and particularly maybe what's going on in Yosemite. And you mentioned that, well, I don't exactly, but it's sort of thrust at me on occasion. But, to frame it a little bit, as you've watched, maybe El Cap get climbed more and more quickly, and as you've watched maybe it get free climbed by certain people over the years. And, recently the nose was climbed, and I couldn't quote you the number, but it was less time than it took us to have lunch today.
Yeah.
What are sort of maybe your thoughts? Like, because I can only imagine when you guys sat below an El Cap that had never been climbed, and now we're standing in a time when it gets climbed all the time and even so fast. I mean, can you sort of frame maybe some of your thoughts as those pieces of information have flowed across your mind?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that that Alex Honnold,
sure, yeah,
his free solos hit me in the head more strongly than the speed trials up El Cap, though they're both amazing.
Mm-hmm.
When I hear of El Cap being done faster than I or my friends could run up the side,
right,
then that's pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
That's too fast.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think knowing your philosophy and you were such not just a climber, but this lover of the nature and of the natural world that surrounded you while you were climbing. Yeah, maybe 2.5 hours doesn't give you much time to sit and contemplate those things.
2.5 hours is really fast.
Exactly. So, and getting towards the end of this, and when you do hear about Alex Honnold's ascents in Yosemite and these speed climbs, and are you still able to feel your influence in that world in Yosemite, and in terms of that thing that you guys started, continuing on through the ages? Do you feel like it's gone far enough away that it's not there anymore, or do you still feel that influence?
I don't feel the influence.
No?
No. Not sure.
When someone does El Cap in 2.5 hours?
It's foreign to me, but many things are.
Right.
So I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to say back, you're humble, I think, in that opinion of your influence, because as I was there and I've been back, recently, the fact that everyone still is trying to do these things in a style of adventure that I think harkens back to what you guys started. And also, although there's been obviously more and more bolts put in, there's still generally a feeling and an ethic of doing your best without them, especially on El Cap.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'd like to say that, yeah, you're still there. You're still someone who I think people think about as in terms of.
Well, it's nice to still be there. Thank you very much.
You're still, you're the ideas you guys started, I think, still whisper through the valley. So, I'm appreciative of it. So, but
I don't think we started the ideas. We kept them going.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, let me just wrap up by asking you about your book series.
Yes.
That you're writing. The way I understand it, it's approximately a decade per book, or approximately, and there's going to be
the first book wraps around my solo ascent of the Leaning Tower, and it has to do with where I was born in West Virginia.
Okay.
Growing up through the Scouts in Southern California when I started climbing.
Uh-huh.
And the second book is more about climbing. It's in Southern California and finishes with the Ascent of Half Dome. The third book, which I've finished writing and is at the printers now, we hope to have it out by September, is called Royal Robbins: The Golden Age.
Okay.
And that has to do with the ascent in Yosemite of El Capitan, the second ascent of the nose, and the first ascent of the Solivay, the first ascent of the in 1964 of the North America Wall, and also in 1960, must have been 63 of the direct route on Half Dome. So it's a lot about Yosemite.
Well, that sounds great. It's going to be out in the fall.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, and the first one is again called To Be Brave, and the second one is Fail Falling.
Fail Falling. Yes.
Okay. And the third one will be The Golden Age.
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I'm gonna reminisce one more time about something that I have that's connected to you. But I climbed Mount Proboscis in 1996.
Oh.
And I have a much treasured photo of us holding your original summit register.
Oh.
With your name on it, with Core's name on it, with Dick's name on it, and with Jim's name all on that original register. And that trip was made for me by finding that when we went up there. So
congratulations.
Yeah, it was an amazing moment for all of us because we were all guys who knew the history of the area and were steeped in it, and to find that little relic up there was an amazing moment for me. So, and equally awesome is to have met you, sir, and I'm really glad that you
very
sat
much.
down with me. And
good to be here. See you tonight.
Thanks again, Royal.
Bye-bye.
All right, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to David Smart for joining me to get that done, helping me clear the way to put out that interview with Royal Robbins. David's book, Royal Robbins, The American Climber, is available wherever you get your books. Go to the Mountaineers website. That's probably your best bet. Hook those guys up. And, of course, my respects to the family of Royal Robbins. Rest in peace, sir. There was some tragedy in the end of Royal Robbins' life, just the degenerative disease to a man whose physical prowess had carried him through life. However, 82, a life well lived, a half-century romance with Liz, 2 kids that loved him, and of course his indelible mark on climbing, big wall climbing, free climbing, and even bouldering. What indelible mark are you going to make? No, that's too much pressure. Just go out and have fun, and be safe. And of course, check your knots.
Old age hath yet his honour and his toil. Death closes all. But something, ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done. Not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes. The slow moon climbs. The deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles to see the great Achilles, whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.